Okay, we're live. Thank you everyone for joining us in person and online. I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Andi Greene. Andi's joining us from CSU Monterey, where Andi's a lecturer. And she also works on the intersection between personal identity and field of study, and is trying to form community and connections within STEM. I also wanted to say that Andi, on top of being a lecturer and doing some amazing work there, she's also directing a nonprofit called Climate Aware, hosting the Badass Women in STEM podcast, which we love, and works with diverse faculty across the CSU system. So Andi's going to be working with us today on a little bit of a different lecture. We're actually going to be doing a little more of an interactive. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to welcome Andi with me. Welcome.
Thank you. So it looks like we are all geared up with our 3 pieces of paper, and they are labeled scrap, which we have questions about, activity 1 and activity 2, and we have some writing utensils. So welcome. This afternoon, we are going to learn 2 ways to effectively communicate STEM. First, by honoring our identities, and second, by practicing humility. I hope to offer up a space for reflection and self-inquiry. Every single day, we are bombarded with so much new information, but can we sit here as individuals and as a community and reflect on where we are to better our future? Many higher ed STEM faculty are simply not educated in educating. We may have had teaching assistantships in graduate school, but who actually was prepared on their first day of instruction? Not me. This is our best kept secret, but it's quite obvious to our students. So today will be a discussion and activity-based lecture where we will talk to learn. A concept that I have come to know and love and utilize in the classroom as a participant of the Transforming STEM Teaching Faculty Learning Program at my institution, CSU Monterey Bay. We actually experienced the greatest loss of new information within 18 to 24 hours of receiving it. So making memories changes the brain. Thinking and dialogic skills form the basis of active analytic thought and allow learners to develop the ability to communicate their ideas. In short, talking makes thinking visible. STEM is difficult. This is why we have major problems with student and professional retention, known as the leaky pipeline. So why bother communicating complex topics in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? You and I, and collectively the brains and bodies in this room, make up an authority in STEM. We have a massive amount of knowledge that is worth sharing. We must take this fact seriously because our influence and impact is more resounding than we even believe. Many view us, and we even view ourselves sometimes, held away in this safe ivory tower. But let's get our brains thinking. So we're going to, using that scrap sheet of paper, write down our own definition for communication. So, communication is the process of exchanging ideas, information, and feelings between people. Maybe we wrote something similarly. This can take the form of various means like speech, writing, and body language. But it's an essential aspect to human interaction, especially creating and maintaining our relationships. Now let's do the same thing for community. So hopefully you linked the two, communication and community. Communication plays a vital role in creating and strengthening communities by facilitating interaction and collaboration among members. Maybe images of people or places came to mind. I think of my hydrology and geology students, all of the hard work that they do in just one semester. I also think of my introduction to environmental science students. This is a large lecture. I have 67 students, and they're mainly non-scientists. Good communication enhances our sense of community, but more importantly, our sense of self. So our first activity of two is to explore our identities. Today, we may proudly call ourselves scientists or engineers, but that title took time. For undergraduate Latina students who recognize themselves as STEM people, enthusiasm for learning disciplinary concepts and an ability to innovate and think critically were key attributes cited as indicative to them identifying as a STEM person. For 5 minutes, we will create a word cloud consisting of our many identities, where larger text sizes indicate greater significance compared to smaller text sizes. Here is a snippet of my word cloud. So let's begin doing that, and then we can start talking to learn. Feel free to use markers and be expressive. If you're a really strategic person, you might think of making a list first and then figuring out how you want to create this identity word cloud. This is like the existential question, right? Who am I? It may take a moment to think of all of your individual aspects that make you you. One thing that might help is thinking about some of the adjectives that the people who love you use to describe you. Think about how your grandmother might talk about you, what she might say. So now let's circle identities that we do not always feel comfortable sharing with the SIM community. These may be identities that are shared conditionally among certain groups, and you can write notes by that if it helps you. I actually circled Mexican on my example of this because at my institution, we are Hispanic serving. So I can bond and connect with my students on day one. But because my faculty body isn't quite as diverse, I share this fact more conditionally. Although identifying as Mexican is very important to me. So we'll just spend about a minute doing that. Maybe you work with people that only have dogs, so you're afraid to say that you're a cat person. Okay, so now is our time to reflect and discuss this activity with a neighbor or within a small group, sharing our identity word clouds if desired. If you aren't comfortable doing that, flip it over. That's totally fine. But I want you to consider the proportion of circled versus uncircled identities. Where can you relate? And when did you start identifying as a STEM person? Okay, so I wanted to share with you all my identity word cloud, and this is me. This is who I am, and it actually took me a little while to dive into who I am as a person. As I said, that existential question. Some aspects are subject to change over time, and that's totally okay. I only share my rare autoimmune disease when the topic comes up. I'm an outdoors woman. I hunt and I fly fish, but I am less likely to share that I hunt in spaces that are inflicted by gun violence. So I want to be sensitive to that fact. My mom was in the Army, and that's a really sensitive topic for me. So I have to be emotionally prepared before I talk about that, about her being a veteran. What factors allow us to open up or conversely shut down? Time is necessary to opening up and expressing ourselves, but is it more important than mutual respect or tolerance? Maybe we want to maintain privacy in the workplace, or maybe we shut down if we feel oppressed or are the target of unwanted hostility. What part may we play as STEM authorities in promoting or oppressing the many identities that we come into contact with? Are we properly gendering our students and colleagues, for example? This year, I joined a cohort of underrepresented STEM faculty within the CSU system, led by Dr. Danny Almeida. The CSU Alliance for Diversity and Strengths of STEM faculty, or Agap as we call it, supports diverse early career faculty in a way that is individualized, focuses on our strengths, and is culturally informed. I was quite nervous when applying to this. Who am I to think that I'm Mexican? I'm white passing. I don't speak Spanish, and it was my grandmother who immigrated here after all, not me. But I was so wrong. I was welcomed with open arms, and I have met some of the most cherished mentors during this year-long cohort. This is where I learned that my top 3 strength is communication. 17 out of 23 CSUs actually participated in our cohort, but it is increasingly hard. Despite it being the CSU, the largest public university system in the United States, it is hard to find diverse faculty and recruit them. And it is a well-known fact that diverse faculty are overworked, yet play a pivotal role within their communities. Our second and last activity is to do one of my favorite things, which is criticize STEM. I do love to talk about its many pros. There's this big issue that I have just touched on, which is the lack of diversity in STEM. In my field of earth sciences, it is one of the worst. So mentoring for first generation underrepresented students should emphasize one-on-one skill development. Affective or emotional support. Information and skills to navigate rather than internalize bias and prejudice. And political guidance focused on the skills and strategies to succeed in predominantly white institutions. For 5 minutes, let's create a pros and cons list relating to STEM. We can think across scales where we have our personal experience in STEM, as well as the outsider's view of STEM. Here's an example of my list. So just like we did before, we are going to circle a few of our items, 3 pros and 3 cons that we feel disproportionately impact STEM. And again, my example. And now we will spend another 5 minutes discussing, reflecting with our neighbors, and exchanging lists. Consider summing pros and cons. Does one side outweigh the other? How does your interpretation of STEM relate to your identity word cloud?
Yeah, I put barrier into Yeah, it's like, well, you're not Yeah, so pros, so when advanced technology is probably but found it's future on how to care for it, so in general,
So this is a list of pros and cons that some of my introduction to environmental science students created. And if you remember, they are non-scientists. So they were able to identify pros like innovation, expanding opportunity, and even cons like imposter syndrome. And actually, for the first time in my career, I felt imposter syndrome preparing for this talk because the California Academy of Sciences, it's so grand. And this is my first professional seminar talk. Oh, thanks. So STEM is but one microcosm of current American society, with some issues being STEM specific and others not. For example, listed as a con is the national level of socioeconomic development. And this is a non-specific issue that impacts people and fields like medicine, women's and LGBTQ rights, and even conflict and war. To help address STEM disparities, I have started a nonprofit, Climate Aware, with my older brother, who's a geologist, Andria Greene, and my best friend, who is a coastal scientist, Dr. Nicole Foster. So in summer 2022, we hired on 3 interns, Sonia, Valerie, and V, all who share more than one minority identity in STEM each. 2 of the 3 won outstanding research posters that summer for their work studying in a newly restored coastal marsh in our locality. All 3 were students of mine. But I can tell you that I watched several walls break down as I transitioned from being their professor to a trusted mentor. I will say that I was not perfect, but I learned so much from this summer. Our current initiative is Badass Women in STEM podcast, hosted by Nicole and myself. Nicole is an Aussie who I met, surprisingly, at a conference in 2019 in Mobile, Alabama, of all places. And over many beers and idea sharing, we even talked about this podcast. Our No Topics Off Limit podcast explores the intersectionality of women. Dr. Amandeep Kaur was our first guest. She's a chemist at Monash Institute of Pharmaceutical Sciences. While her work is fascinating, her story is really the highlight of the episode.
When I was in school, I think around that time, for one of my birthdays, and I really don't remember when, my mom gave me a magic mug. The mug changed color when a hot liquid was poured into it, like water or tea or coffee. And I was very excited as a kid. I remember I was like, that is so cool. Like now I can do the magic, and I can be a magician. I remember sharing this with my science teacher at school the next day. I was like, oh, you know what? This is what happened. And as soon as I poured in hot milk in it and it changed color, And she was like, yeah, that's really cool. But do you know how that happens? And I was like, it's magic. It was chemistry. The mug was coated with some chemical molecules that changed color in response to heat. And I was like, really, really fascinated. I think that was my sort of inspiration moment, or moment of like magic in a way, in my life at least. Women in my community are not allowed in a way to study after high school. So you expected that you'll finish your high school, get married, have kids, and take care of the household.
So Amandeep goes on to explain how she has influenced women in her community in India, cousins and distant relatives, to go to school. Despite the odds, like her parents' lack of support, now they're joyfully supportive of her. Our podcast hasn't launched yet, so please do stay tuned. And I want to end today with a daily dose of humility, although we have been practicing humility with each other this entire time. It helps to keep our big egos in check, and trust me, I have a very big ego as a scientist. So on your scrap paper, write down a recent STEM-related failure, and I'll join in on this one too. So when you're done, I want you to give your paper to a neighbor to read. Are we bold enough to do that? Yes? Have we traded? You'll like the next part. And just read it to yourself. And now, once you have read their failure, we are going to ball it up. Ball it up, ball it up. Failures are painful, sure, but they are not worth hiding, and certainly don't define us. How did it feel to practice humility today as a small community? How might we apply kindness, tolerance, and respect to ourselves and others, to our students, our mentees, our mentors, to our colleagues, or simply to a stranger, to best advance the field of science, tech, engineering, and mathematics? Dare we work together as a community to truly advance STEM? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Oh, and a hokie. So my alma maters, I graduated from Virginia Tech, and a hokie is basically a turkey. But you're supposed to say, what's a hokie? I am. And then an otter is the CSU Monterey Bay. Yeah, so we're the otters. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Getting together like this. Communication. That's like, we need to trust one another. We need to get outside of our comfort zones to, in the long term, be more comfortable in these spaces. Calling out poor behavior. Being the whistleblower is one of the most honorable things you could do. That's where I think it needs to begin. And I saw a lot of the cons that were listed were action items, as I mentioned. So we have very specific needs. It's not vague, and we can address them. It's just realizing that we have authority. That's self-realization and acting on it. It is, yeah. Mm-hmm. Allies, looking for allies, because you're right, it's extremely difficult. I can say this being a white passing person who identifies as Hispanic. So that time that my mom was in the Army, I was raised by my grandmothers. And it's important for me to share this because it's a part of me and it makes me more human. So when we have allies that can stand by us and get things done, why not? It's I have a very low tolerance for certain things, and we can change them. I do believe that. Yep. Sexual assault. Women who, or any person of any gender who's experiencing unwanted advances. One thing that I didn't say, but may have become obvious, is that when we compared the proportion of circled identities to uncircled, or our pros and cons lists, typically minority identities have a cons list that outweighs their pros list. So that can lead to a poor state of mental health and feeling alone in STEM, even suicide in worse instances. And these problems are compounded when we aren't receiving the right support that we need. And as I mentioned before, we're internalizing the negative energy, so to speak, or actions in our workplace. And that happens in STEM. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just a microcosm. So, but thank you.
Well, thank you everyone so much for joining. We have some people from Pakistan.
Wow. Welcome. Hello, Pakistan and Florida.
I want to say thank you again so much.
Thank
for
you.
joining us and having this thought-provoking session. I think we're all
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I do too.
I'm gonna stay with this one.
Oh.
So I'll meet you back at the reception. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll meet you.
From the UC, so we've been doing
Wonderful.
program and
Wait, the Agap program or the FLP? Yes. So it's like all the resources, so like talking, you know, talking to learn. That's stuff that's taken away from this year long. I get my my graduation certificate tomorrow. Oh my God, that's exciting! You're on me. She's gonna be so excited. I'm probably she didn't work with people and we had originally titled some of that stuff during our education. Oh my gosh, it is so. And then it transferred over to the FLP, so it was like amazing. I love the FLP. And it's the learning. Because we've had a lot of people who just are Great. Remind me your name? Lindsay, okay. Yeah. Nice to meet you. Well, that's wonderful. I'm glad that you recognize the FLP. Yeah. Because it's something that they do at CSU and it's like, we offer, I mean, we get cookies, but it's not, it's like a modern way to show up and learn how to teach. So. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Great. And I hope they don't talk to it. So, yeah, I'm trying to, we were talking to learn. Like, yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it, Lindsay. Yeah, thanks for the effort. Nice to meet you. We're gonna go look at some minutes. I teach minerals in rock art. So I don't know about that. Sure. Hey, if you need to guess at any mineral, right? Unless it's like right? Yeah. Let's show up. I just choose about oh, it's totally it's not fair. Okay, we can do a little walk around and like the lab and everything. Are you guys going? Okay. And then I'll just meet you. Thank you. Sure. Okay, let's enjoy. Yeah. Yes, it's all. Oh, I know. Yeah.